talking about some of the bats. We'll be talking about some of the bats that you can find in your backyard, as well as some of the bats that we're going to find all around the world who can vary a lot more than people might expect. So to start, bats are animals, and more specifically mammals. They make up the order Chiroptera, and then within that there are two suborders, Microchiroptera and Macrochiroptera, which basically just means small bats and big bats. Most bats fit into the micro category. There are about 150 species of Macrochiroptera, and these are all going to be old world fruit bats. So they're the really big bats like flying foxes that you've probably seen in nature documentaries or in pictures, because they tend to be some of the most photogenic bats as well. Just to kind of give you a picture, here's a sampling of some of the different species of bats you can find. So you can see that we've got some very big ones who can fly along the water. We've got the bumblebee bat, which is so small that if its wings are folded, it can rest comfortably on your thumb. We've got brown bats, we've got silver bats, we've got hunter and white bats who are very cute, and they like to make little tents out of leaves that they will nest under during the day. So that's what that picture on the left is showing. And then we've got nectar-eating bats, carnivorous bats, and of course, probably the most famous, vampire bats. So there are about 1,400 species of bats in the world. So out of 6,500 species of mammals, that makes them about 21%. That makes them the second most diverse type of mammal. The only thing that is more diverse are rodents, which make up about 40% of mammals total. So when you account for bats and rodents, that's over 60% right there. So there isn't very much room left for some of the mammals people might be more familiar with, like tigers or elephants. And then in addition, the species count might vary just based on different classifications. Sometimes one group might consider two types of bats a separate species, whereas another might consider them both to be part of the same species. The thing that's probably most unique about bats is that they're the only mammals on Earth in the history of life that have been able to fly. No other mammal has ever achieved true flight. The closest any other mammal gets is like a flying squirrel, where they can glide for a while, but they can't make themselves stay aloft. The name Chiroptera, the order the bats are in, actually means hand wing. And if you look at this picture, you can see why they get called that. The bones in yellow represent the hands. And so on a bat, you can very clearly see where the 5 fingers are and how they give the wing structure. Whereas in a bird, those hand bones are all fused together into one sort of smaller extension of the arm, where their wing structures are mostly determined by feathers. And so like if you ever had chicken wings, you'll know that there isn't as much meat on them as there might be on the arms of another species. So if you're ever sad, just remember bats literally fly through the power of jazz hands. They're just waving their hands around the entire time that they're in the air. They have to flap a lot, so they do a lot of jazz hands throughout the night. In addition, so bats fly slower than birds generally. So what that means is like the fastest bat is not going to be as fast as the fastest bird. The slowest bat will probably be slower than the slowest bird, but there are going to be sort of some bats that are faster than some birds. Most bat species aren't able to glide. The only one that can is the Samoan flying fox, which also happens to be the only bat that's entirely diurnal. So that means that it's the only bat that is only out during the day. Most other bats are either exclusively nocturnal, so out at night, or they might be a mix where they'll be out during the day and during the night. Generally, larger wingspans are relative to body size are going to favor faster flying speeds, whereas shorter wings will favor more maneuverability. So bats that eat flying insects often have larger wingspans relative to their body size, so that way they can quickly swoop in and grab the insect out of the air. Whereas bats that feed off of vegetation or ground-based prey are more likely to have shorter wingspans because they need to be more maneuverable. That said, this isn't like a firm rule. There are exceptions. For example, a lot of flying foxes have very large wingspans, and this is because they have to survey very large areas for their food, even though they only eat fruit. So they need to be able to fly very fast. The other thing that's probably most unique about bats is echolocation. So they are not the only animals that do this. Other animals such as whales, dolphins, shrews, and even a few birds have been shown to use echolocation. But bats are probably some of the best examples of it, and they use it the most effectively for their various hunting strategies. It helps them with navigating in the dark, although bats do actually have very good eyesight and can usually see pretty well. They use the echolocation to assist them with navigating and also to identify prey. The calls that they make are incredibly high pitched, from 20,000 hertz on the low end to 200,000 hertz on the high end. So for reference, a human's hearing range is somewhere between 20 and 20,000 hertz. So the very highest end of the human hearing range is at the very lowest end of a bat's echolocating call. So theoretically, it might be possible for a human to hear a bat call, but in practice, probably not, because our hearing is most sensitive in the 2,000 to 5,000 hertz range. And that's a good thing, because their calls can be incredibly loud, up to 140 decibels, which is about the same noise level of standing next to a tornado siren. And speaking from experience, I can tell you that's really loud. So when you have all these bats that are flying around, there's worry about their calls potentially interfering with each other. And bats actually do account for this. When they're in groups, they will engage in mutual suppression. So that means that bats will make fewer calls in the presence of other bats. Even though bats do have unique voices, the way the echolocation works, other sounds that are happening at the same time can still disrupt it, even if they are able to tell the difference between their echolocating calls and another bat's echolocating calls. So that's why bats will try to avoid making too many calls when they're in groups. So this here is a spectrogram, and this shows a depiction of bat calls. So if any of you have ever been on the UEC's bat surveys, you might have seen these as we are walking. This is for an eastern red bat, which is a native species to Wisconsin. And what you can see on the left is that these sort of reverse Nike swooshes are very close together. And then as they go right, they start to get further apart. So what this might signify is a feeding buzz. Basically, when a bat is targeting an insect, it will increase the frequency of its calls, or increase how many calls it makes, in order to have as precise a location on the bat as possible. And then when it's not tracking a specific insect, their calls might be a little bit slower. So bats have a variety of diets. They can feed on fruit and vegetation, nectar. They can be carnivorous. We've got vampire bats that drink blood, and we've got, of course, insectivorous bats. Many bats are not exclusively in one of these categories. They'll instead potentially mix and match. So you might have a fruit bat that also eats nectar, a nectar-eating bat that also eats insects. There are a bunch of different combinations. The only one that doesn't mix and match are vampire bats. They do live exclusively on blood and nothing else. So I'm going to start by talking about fruiting bats. We're going to sort of go through how they fit into their different ecologies, and then we're also going to do a species highlight for each of these types of bat diets as well. So for fruit bats, they're generally going to be found in tropical or semi-tropical regions of Asia, Africa, the Pacific Islands, as well as Central and South America. All megabats are fruit bats, as well as a lot of microbats are also considered fruit bats. And fruit bats act as essential seed dispersers for fruits like bananas, mangoes, and guava. The reason that they're so effective is because, unlike a lot of other species that feed off of fruit trees, when a bat grabs a piece of fruit, it'll usually fly it somewhere else to eat it. So as they're eating it, they'll drop seeds. And so that allows the seeds to travel a lot further than they would if another species was trying to eat it. So for example, like a monkey might just eat a piece of fruit in the tree it found it in, and then the seeds will drop right at the bottom of the tree, and those seeds will probably not have a chance to germinate. Whereas the seeds carried by a bat are more likely to end up somewhere new where they can possibly grow. Similarly, bats also have seeds that pass through the digestive system. And since they go to the bathroom while they're flying, that also makes them very effective seed dispersers, even if those seeds had to go through a slightly grosser process first. So I want to highlight the gray-headed flying fox. This is a fruit bat, a megabat specifically, that is endemic to Eastern Australia. They can form huge colonies by day. There could be tens of thousands of animals in a single colony. And then by night, they will generally fly solo, but then they return to their colonies the next day. And a single individual might disperse over 60,000 seeds per night. So just by those numbers, if you have tens of thousands of animals and 60,000 seeds each, they can really help with plant reproduction. So they are essential to keeping the forests in Eastern Australia alive. Our next category of bats are nectar-eating bats. So these guys have a lot of similarities to fruit bats. They tend to live in about the same areas, mostly tropical and semi-tropical. They might travel into slightly more temperate zones. We don't have any fruit bats in the United States, but we do have some nectar-eating bats that will come up here during the summer. So nectar-eating bats rely on flowers that often evolve to be pollinated just by bats. These flowers typically open at night. They're going to be large in size, pale or white in color, so that way they're easier to spot at nighttime. And then they'll be very fragrant with like a fermenting or fruit-like odor. Some plants that depend on bats for pollination are agave, cacao, and peaches. So if you ever have enjoyed tequila, chocolate, or peaches, you have bats to thank for them. Our species highlight for this is going to be the Mexican long-tongued bat. So this is one of those species that lives in Central America for most of the year, but during the summer, it will come up and visit the southern United States. It can be found from Southern California to Southern Texas. It is a leaf-nosed bat, which these sort of oddly shaped noses might seem like they're used for smell, but they're actually probably used to help direct their echolocating cries. So basically help them be more focused when the bats are using them. They will follow a migratory nectar corridor of cactus and agave blooms from Mexico to the southern US in the summer, and then in the winter they return down to Mexico and Central America. As well, they also do eat cactus fruits. So these are one of those species that has diversified. They'll eat both nectar and fruits when available. And they have incredibly long tongues, which can sometimes be half their body length. That way, when they're trying to get nectar from a flower, they can really reach in there and get as much as possible, which is good because they tend to do this very quickly. They'll hover in front of a flower and thrust their head in to get nectar, and they can do all of this in less than a second. Most of these photos that you see of bats with like the black backdrop, like the one here, are taken by Merlin Tuttle. He's a famous bat conservationist and photographer, and it takes him thousands of attempts to get these shots just right because of how quick the bats can be. The next category of bats is probably the least well known, and these are carnivorous bats. They make up fewer than 1% of all bat species, so they aren't a huge amount, but they're still a very important part of the ecosystems in which they live. They're found mainly, again, in tropical regions of the world, so Central and South America, Africa, Asia, and Australia. They are typically going to be larger than insect-eating bats, although none are quite large enough to be considered megabats. And they have different hunting tactics depending on their prey. So, for example, spectral bats, which live in Central and South America, are the largest carnivorous bat in the Western Hemisphere. And the way that they will ambush prey is they'll hang from a tree or a branch and wait for something to pass beneath them and then drop down on it so they can take a bite. This can include things like birds, small mammals, or even other bats. And some species of carnivorous bats in Africa have learned to identify frog calls. They'll listen for their mating calls and they know which ones are poisonous and which ones aren't, so they know what's good to eat. Our species highlight for this is actually going to be the greater bulldog bat, which is a fishing bat. And I'm going to let the great David Attenborough conduct this species highlight. Oh, sorry.
The rainforests of Belize in Central America. And as evening falls and the shower comes to an end, a predator begins to hunt. Greater Bulldog Bat, a flying mammal and a fisherman. A fish swimming just below the surface creates telltale ripples. And that is all the bat needs to detect them. With little more than a fin to aim for, and whilst flying at 40 miles an hour, the bat takes the fish completely unawares. If the shoal scatters, the bat trawls the surface. Raking the water, trying to snag a fish. He won't have the best fishing spot to himself for long, and soon other bats arrive. Oncoming traffic would make grabbing a fish almost impossible. So the bats avoid collisions by honking, dropping their calls an octave to say, "Look out, here I come." Soon the shoal has either been captured or has fled, and the bats move on.
So yeah, bats can really adapt to almost any niche. The only places that they aren't found are extreme deserts or extreme cold, so you won't find them in the Arctic or in the Sahara, but otherwise they're going to be able to find some way to fit into just about any ecological niche. Next up are vampire bats. As I mentioned, they're probably the most famous kinds of bats because of their sort of the mythology of vampires in general. The likely origin of this is probably from European explorers in the 15th and 16th century who came to Central and South America and discovered vampire bats or found them. And then when they went back to their homes and told the people there about what they saw, it kind of just became intertwined with myths of vampirism naturally, since bats already have a very negative image in a lot of European cultures. Especially around that time, they tended to be associated with witchcraft. So it's not a very far gap to move to vampirism. There are only 3 species of vampire bats on Earth, and they all live in Central and South America. They use their sharp incisors to make an incision in the prey's skin and then will lap up the blood so they don't actually suck blood like some rumors might have people think. Their saliva contains an anticoagulant that's used to prevent the wound from clotting. That way they're able to get as much blood as they can from any particular piece of prey. And actually, the anticoagulant properties of their saliva have been studied by scientists to develop blood thinners. So they're used to help prevent blood clots that can cause strokes, heart attacks, or pulmonary embolism. Of the 3 species, 2 of them prefer to feed on birds, and 1 of them prefers to feed on mammals. That said, these preferences are not set in stone. The ones who prefer birds will feed on mammals. The one who prefers mammals will feed on birds as the opportunities arise. And unlike just about every other kind of bat, vampire bats are able to take off from the ground. This is essential since vampire bats need to be able to quickly take off if they're discovered by whoever they're trying to drink blood from. The way that they're able to do this is that vampire bats are actually able to hop around on the ground. They'll usually land near another animal and then kind of hop their way over to them and then slowly crawl up to an easy place for them to make an incision. They'll generally prefer an area that doesn't have any fur or any feathers, but they can use their teeth to cut away some of those if they have to. And our species highlight is going to be the common vampire bat. This is probably the most famous of the 3 vampire species. This is the one that prefers mammal blood. So it will generally prefer to feed on livestock, such as cows and horses. Specifically, they really seem to like horses more than anything. But they'll also feed on wildlife, such as tapirs. And they do occasionally feed on humans, but this is incredibly rare. And within these preferences, they also tend to prefer to feed off of female animals. And the reason for this isn't exactly known, but it's theorized that it could be something to do with the hormones in their blood. Interestingly, common vampire bats have developed a form of social welfare where members of a colony will feed each other when needed. This is extremely important because blood has a very low calorie count. So if a vampire bat misses feeding for 2 or 3 days, they're probably going to starve to death. So what they do is they engage in sort of mutual grooming behavior. And while they're doing this, they can check each other to see whether their bellies are full. If one has a very full belly and one does not, then they might regurgitate some of their blood up to the one who hasn't eaten so they can stay alive. That said, they do have a sort of social reciprocity in this behavior. Bats who share are more likely to be shared with. Bats who do not share are less likely to be shared with. And this occurs mainly between a mother and her pup, but it can occur between other related individuals and even unrelated individuals. So it's very interesting to sort of study their behavior. Vampire bats actually have some of the most developed neocortexes of any bat species, which basically that's the area of the brain that is largely responsible for social behavior. So it makes sense that they have more developed societies, if you will, than a lot of other animals might. And vampire bats do have a sort of heat sensor in their nose, which they use to determine where blood vessels are beneath the skin. And they'll try to find like the best place on an animal to make their incision so they can start drinking. And finally, we come to insectivorous bats. So these are the bats that live primarily or entirely off of insects. All of the native species in Wisconsin are insectivores. So they can typically eat up to half their body weight in a night. It can be even more than this if it's a nursing female, since they have to get a bit of extra energy for their baby as well. The pest control value of bats just in the United States is valued to be between $3 and $52 billion per year. And some species will eat flying insects on the wing. Some will snatch insects off the ground. This occurs, for example, in deserts where you might have bats that will eat scorpions or centipedes. And they do eat mosquitoes, although mosquitoes are generally not their preferred prey. That said, insectivorous bats have been found to have an effect on mosquito reproduction because the mosquitoes that they are most likely to eat are those who are getting ready to lay their eggs. They're usually going to be filled up with both eggs that they're ready to lay and with blood that they just drank to give them energy. So that makes them both easier targets, and it also makes them have more nutritional value to the bats. So instead of doing a single species highlight, I wanted to kind of talk about all of the different species of bats that we have here in Wisconsin. So we have 7 native species, the big brown bat, the little brown, the northern long-eared, the tricolor, silver-haired, the eastern red, and the hoary bat. Some of these bats hibernate for the winter when they're in Wisconsin or other parts of the northern US and Canada, and some will migrate south to Mexico or Central America during the winter. And similarly, some will live in large colonies, some will live in smaller groups. Generally, the ones who hibernate tend to live in bigger groups, and the ones who migrate will live in smaller groups. So to start, we'll talk about our hibernating bats. So these are known as cave bats, and they include the northern long-eared, the tricolor, the little brown, and the big brown bats. They typically hibernate in caves or mines or even buildings during the winter. And these are all species that are susceptible to whitenose syndrome, which is a fungal pathogen that has been spreading through bat populations in the United States and Canada since 2006. I'm not going to go into too much depth about this just because the focus of my next presentation is going to be mainly on how whitenose syndrome has affected Wisconsin's bat population. So if you come to that presentation, you'll get to hear a whole lot more about it. The other kind of bats that we have here in Wisconsin are tree bats. So these are the ones who are typically going to migrate. These include the eastern red, the hoary, or not the hoary, sorry, the eastern red and the silver-haired bats. They're more likely to live individually or in small colonies, typically in forested areas near trees. And they often live inside of trees. So they'll live like underneath loose bark or other crevices and rocks, as well as the occasional building. Interestingly, some species such as the silver-haired bat have been found to carry Pseudomonas destructans, which is the fungal pathogen that causes whitenose syndrome, but they don't demonstrate any of the symptoms. And this might be because they don't hibernate, so there isn't any chance for those symptoms to develop, or just a natural immunity that they have. In addition to our 7 native species, we also have 2 visiting species. We have the Indiana bat and the evening bat. Maternity colonies for these have been found in 2016, so that means that their visitation is not just like a few bats who wandered outside of their range. It means that they are living and reproducing here. The reason for their range expansion is unknown. It has been theorized that they could be here because of climate change. Warming temperatures might make the more northern parts of the US more habitable to them. Or it could also be because they're filling niches that are left empty by bat populations that are dying from things such as whitenose syndrome, pesticide use, or extermination. Speaking of, let's talk about some of the threats to bat conservation. So the greatest threats include habitat destruction, which is applicable to pretty much any animal or plant species on Earth. Pesticide use is another one as well, both because it can poison the food that they eat, aka other insects, and it can also directly poison the bats. It may not be intentional, but it still happens. Human disturbance of maternity colonies and hibernating populations. Whenever a hibernating population in particular is disturbed, that can cause them to wake up during the winter, which then causes them to burn a ton of energy. So that way they might starve to death because they aren't able to go out and forage for insects in the winter. White-nose syndrome and wind farms are also problems for bats. Wind farms are less because of bats crashing into wind turbines and more because the wind turbines, when they're spinning, they change the air pressure around them, which when a bat flies into that area might cause them to plummet to the ground or lose their sense of direction. And then additionally, extermination by humans. Unfortunately, bats are still not perceived very well by people. This is especially true now with COVID-19 potentially originating from bats. So people tend to see bats and assume that they're a pest that needs to be eliminated. So what can you do to help with bat conservation? One of the big things is promoting natural bat habitat. So this can mean planting native species in your yard, particularly trees. And if you have any dead or dying trees, as long as they're not a safety hazard, it's actually better to leave them up because they make great roosting spots for bats. They usually like to nest under the bark during the day. So they can be very good spots if you ever want to go bat watching. Try to check out a dead or dying tree that's within about a half mile of a natural body of water. Other things you can do are avoid disturbing bats. So if there's an area where you know bats tend to congregate that you can avoid going to, please do that. Safely remove or exclude bats. So if you ever have bats in your house, make sure that you remove them safely, which is something that we'll talk about in a minute. You can set up a bat house, which functionally is sort of similar to a bird house, but in practicality, they're actually pretty different. For instance, they tend to have their entrance/exits on the bottom, so bats can drop out and immediately fly away. You can volunteer or donate to an organization that helps bats. So Merlin Tuttle's Bat Conservation, U.S. Fish and Wildlife, Bat Conservation International, and of course the Urban Ecology Center. And you can also participate in our bat surveys, which are a great chance to learn more about bats, potentially see and hear bats, and also just meet new people. So for bat removal, if you ever have a bat that gets into some place it's not supposed to be, the first thing you should try and do is close any interior doors and then open the windows. You want to try and let the bat fly out on its own if possible. And this can be assisted even further by turning out the lights in the room the bat's in and putting lights on outside. That way it can kind of help guide them towards the window. If it doesn't seem to be leaving on its own and the bat lands somewhere where it can hang, which they will usually pick somewhere like curtains, for example, you can use a plastic tub or container and then a piece of cardboard or paper to gently scrape them in. You basically just put the container over the bat and then use the cardboard to kind of get them in. And then once you release them, make sure that you do it from a great enough height that they can take off. They typically cannot take off from the ground, so it's best to try and kind of raise your container up when you're going to do that, or do it from a higher vantage point like a balcony. And if that's not an option, you can also just put them on a tree and then they can climb up until they reach a point where they can take off on their own. And then it's important to try and cover up any holes where bats might try to get in. So bats are actually very flexible and they're able to fit into holes as small as half an inch. So you want to try and be proactive about making sure that there aren't any entry points for bats. The best time of year to do this is during the winter, because it's very unlikely you're going to have bats in your home during the winter. That said, if you do have a hibernating group, it might be good to call an animal control specialist. If for any reason you think someone might have been bitten, for example, if there was a bat in a room while someone was asleep, or if you have any open wounds that either were or were not there before you noticed the bat, it's best to try and capture the bat and then bring it to a vet so they can perform a rabies test on it. If that is not possible, then it's usually good to talk with your doctor and see if you should get preventive rabies vaccinations, because unfortunately with rabies, once you have developed symptoms, it's too late. So the best measures are to be preventive early on. And let's say you do want to erect a bat house. Bat houses can be great shelters for bats, especially from the spring through the fall. They are typically not going to be used for hibernating populations during the winter. They aren't going to be able to be warm enough for them consistently, unlike, say, a cave. If you have a bat house, you want to try and place it at least 10 feet off the ground. That way they have plenty of clearance to take off. And I generally find it's better to either buy a kit where you might have pre-made pieces that you can then assemble into the bat house, or to use online plans to make it yourself if you're feeling particularly handy. Pre-made bat houses, I've noticed, tend to not be constructed as well. One of the big defects I've noticed is a lot of them tend to get a little narrower towards the end where the bats enter and exit. And this can cause backups for the bats because they might try to take off, but there's too much, there are more bats at the top than the bottom can accommodate to leave at once. And then finally, it should be south facing and a dark color so that way it'll be warm. This is important any time of year because bats tend to prefer slightly warmer places to nest than you or I might. And if you're interested in building a bat house or in other forms of helping bats, I've got some resources here that you can check out. These will be included in the video of the slideshow that will be posted to YouTube. So some of these are just about learning about bats, like bats of the United States and Canada and bats in question. The two links on the bottom of the nonfiction section are both more practical to help you with selecting a bat house or what to do if you have a bat in your building. And then there are also just some fun fiction books about bats. I read all of these when I was a kid. Silver Wing is a YA series that's very fun, and it's sort of about anthropomorphic bats. And then Stella and Luna and Bat Baby are both great children's books. And with that, that is the end of my presentation. So at this time, I will take any questions.